All right, guys, let's talk about Pete. Pete Hegseth. So Pete was the former host of Fox and Friends, the Weekend Edition, and I knew he was a military guy. I've seen him interact with friends of mine, and knew he was a Army veteran and a former Army officer. I didn't know the extent of his background, but I want to talk a little bit about that because it's very controversial already that he would be nominated for Secretary of Defense. Now, he would be in charge of all branches and a massive 800, I believe, billion-dollar budget. Insane. But the question is, when is he qualified to what has been the normal process or the normal consideration for Secretary of Defense? Right now, retired General Lloyd Austin, who used to be CENTCOM's commander, I believe he was, for a period of time at least, the Central Command commander when I was working under Central Command for various operations or various things that we were doing in the area. I'm more leaning towards this is the guy that we need. Although when I heard it, I was like, what? Really? Like, I never even would have thought about this guy in consideration. Now knowing more about his career and then tying the two together, he's been a Trump loyalist from the beginning. He was considered for the Trump administration in the first 4 years and is very close with the Trump family and obviously President Trump. Vivek Ramaswamy, I believe Elon Musk, for sure Charlie Kirk, and other people close to Donald Trump have been not only vetting, but likely boarding these candidates. So let's say you have 3 prospects. Those 3 prospects are brought into Mar-a-Lago, they're interviewed, and then guys like Charlie Kirk, guys like Vivek Ramaswamy are asking the questions and then taking a step back and going, this is our assessment, and giving Donald Trump the recommendation. I imagine Pete was at least informally, maybe even formally, but at least informally boarded like this and communicated like this to see if he was the right prospect. Now, Pete just wrote a book on our woke military and this war that's being waged against warriors. I think that's awesome because he's articulated in a very constructive way through his book his position and then potentially what he would do policy-wise to change it. Now, the bureaucratic solution is to take institutional legacy people within the organization, which are the bureaucrats, and allow them to work themselves through the process and then be that guy. So typically, if you're looking at SECDEF, if you're looking at D&I, the Director of National Intelligence, even the Director of the CIA, you would look internal to the organization, and then somebody on the rise would come up and you say, hey, this guy was the deputy director. Well, now he's going to be the director. That was the big mistake that Trump made on his initial term. And he admittingly said not picking and selecting the right people for the job, and then thinking that the bureaucrat, the legacy institution, was going to provide the right person or recommendation. And then what we found in the 15 cabinet positions was a lot of infighting, a lot of sabotage and subversion, and a lot of people going against the actual policy when we are trying to be more inclusive with including people that were from the system. I think that's the best tactic. You pick 15 secretaries that are going to be Senate approved and that are going to be outsiders, not insiders. And so the question would be to the legacy media, who's already creating issues when it comes to like Pete's nomination, for sure Matt Gaetz, even Tulsi Gabbard. I mean, I heard an expert on a legacy media channel say Tulsi Gabbard was aligned with Russia. Like, what? Now we're doing the talking points that Hillary Clinton used to suppress and censor her? That's BS. So Tulsi Gabbard, as Director of National Intelligence, who, as part of the recommendation since 9/11, since '04, has been somebody who comes from the intelligence community, has an extensive intelligence background, or somebody who's an officer, lieutenant colonel and above, or senior commissioned officer that's going to be in that position. Tulsi Gabbard is a lieutenant colonel and the reserve component, and now she's going to be the Director of National Intelligence of the 17 intelligence organizations, which is what we need, exactly what we need. So the fear for Pete, and already in the legacy talking points right now from the corporate media, is he doesn't have the experience because he doesn't have the military experience. What are we doing nominating a Fox and Friends host? Like, what? One, Pete has an Ivy League academic experience. His academia comes from the Ivy League, which means, they're holding them to a higher standard. He went to Princeton in 2003, graduated from an ROTC program, and then commissioned as an infantry officer. He got his master's degree from Harvard University. So he's educated. So if you're a host of some show somewhere, doesn't mean you don't have an experience prior to that. Likely, because you've been hired, you have something to offer or bring to the table. So again, legacy media doing what legacy media does. Pete served 20 years across the military and has 20 years in service. Now, let me just delineate this for people who don't understand the Guard Reserve component. The Guard Reserve component, Guards belonging to state, Reserve belonging to the federal government, are reserve components that are utilized in a time typically of war to augment active duty. So the requirement is 1 week in a month, like literally Saturday and Sunday, once a month, and 2 weeks of annual, called AT training, annual training per year. That's a reserve / U.S. Army National Guard belonging to the state requirement. So when somebody says he has 20 years of service, let's be clear, just like with Tim Walz, he didn't have 20 years of active service. He had 20 years in the reserve component. Now, the difference between Walz and Pete is Pete actually served in combat and didn't lie about it. He served in Samarra, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and in Guantanamo Bay. I think I saw his combat hashes on his uniform, which are recognized with 6 months of overseas combat service per hash. I have 4 years worth of that. He has, I believe, 2 years worth of that. Because in the National Guard or Reserve component, which that's where I was a sergeant major, I was an active duty master sergeant, transitioned into the Guard Reserve component, made sergeant major. Typically what happens is you get activated and you go through what's called ADT, where you train up on active orders for the combat rotation. And that can last years. Most Guard Reserve organizations, especially in the infantry, were deployed for a year or more downrange. Most of them extended out to beyond 12, 15, and sometimes 18 months overseas. He also has a Combat Infantryman's Badge, which is an award designated for being in direct combat, being on the receiving end of enemy forces overseas, as an individual award, sometimes blanketed as a unit award if you get a rocket attack in Bagram and your company's on the base. The entire base, as long as you're in a combat MOS, will get a Combat Infantryman's Badge if you're an 11 Bravo, 11 Charlie, 11 Micro, 11 Hotel when I was in. I think they consolidated that to 11 Bravos, which are infantrymen, 11 Charlies, which are mortarmen, in the specific Army MOSs. So he also has 2 Bronze Stars for combat service. Now remember, that's an award that's given for combat, serving in a combat role in a combat theater. And not to take away from the award, I have I have a few Bronze Stars from combat, but that's delineating the difference between Bronze Star for service versus Bronze Star for valorous, specific, courageous actions in combat. Okay, so he has 2 Bronze Stars for service, which again, all these things are beneficial to the experience, but I think most beneficial is his infantry experience is leading a platoon and a company, and I believe making it to the rank of major, which would be a battalion commander in normal infantry world, the normal infantry world. And in special operations world, that would be a company commander, would be a major in charge of a company of 6 special forces ODAs. And I just say that to mean the difference from my experience from Pete's experience. So Pete went to infantry officer basic course or basic school and was awarded the branch of the infantry, was a 2nd and 1st lieutenant, obviously, working himself through the ranks. I don't think he had a ranger tab. If anybody wants to chime in here, whether you looked it up or if he had a ranger tab. Whenever I see an infantry officer or somebody served in the infantry and I see their uniform and they don't have a ranger tab, but for example, they're an officer and they have a combat infantryman's badge, I always take a step back and go, why don't you have a ranger tab? I went to ranger school as a private first class when I was 18. Pete would have went to ranger school after infantry officer basic course as part of his pipeline. But in the Guard Reserve component, there are times when, because of time constraints, because of funds, or whatever it may be, they would not send a Guard or Reserve officer to Ranger School. But there is a chance that he went to Ranger School and he didn't make it, and which happens. It has a high attrition rate. And I'm not saying that's what happened. I'm saying that's a possibility. It just stands out to me. The sergeant major in me sees that on his uniform, and I'm like, why doesn't he have a Ranger tab? At least I didn't see a Ranger tab. So he goes from 2nd to 1st to captain to, I believe, getting out or retiring as a major. He serves in various combat roles and positions in leadership. And then he writes books on education and the war waged against service members because of this woke ideology that's being infiltrated into our branches of service. He is very clear and concise on his feelings on women in the military, women in combat specifically, and then some of the things that he feels about is destroying the morale and capability of our fighting force, which I agree with, being part of the Obama administration and serving, and then seeing how that was changing the way the warfighters were less capable, where we have less retention, less recruitment, and likely less capability and low morale, more so than we've ever had in history. And you think Lloyd Austin, a former general of CENTCOM, as a theater would be able to fix that? No, because it's the same insider. It's the same betrayal. You think a general who went through 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and saw his 4-star and then moved on is thinking about the troops on the ground? No. He's getting lied to from every officer, flag officer, in between his position as Secretary of Defense and the private on the ground whose morale is low because he's being forced to go to DEI training and not focused on combat training. I feel conflicted with the women in combat role. One, and I'll articulate this quickly, one, because I know women who serve in combat and special operations, and that's always been the case. A lot of that is because of the classification, and we don't talk about it. A lot of it has to do with women's roles in operating with special operations to pat down women, to communicate to women, to call out women during a call out, which is a very specific action that's taken when there's a fear of suicide bombers, etc. Also operating and training with women overseas and gathering intelligence and information. If you're in Afghanistan talking to a woman, she's not going to tell you anything. But if you have a woman who's there to bridge the gap, it's going to help. Women have served in special operations in very specific roles unilaterally and bilaterally working by, with, and through indigenous partners, host nation partners, and men in special operations for a very long time as a asset to the special operations world, right? Joe Kent's wife tragically lost her life in a suicide bombing because she was filling a role and capacity in a very specific organization that was collecting information and intelligence. So it's nothing new. The conflict that Pete has is with women serving in direct combat roles, like in Ranger Battalion, with men. As someone who has spent many combat rotations with men in special operations and have seen psychologically, because of the biological difference and the nurturing nature of men protecting, defending women, I've seen what it does to men. When you have one woman in a fire base that's attractive, and then men haven't seen for months, potentially years, a woman, and then what that does psychologically to an organization, what it does more morally and ethically. So take that, set that aside, the biological differences with having a period, a menstrual cycle, that you have to have special considerations for privacy, hygiene, the list goes on. Those create conflicting interest when you're weighing warfighting organizations focused on the War Department and then focused on inclusion. I'll just say that out loud. Are there exceptions? Certainly there are. I mean, you have a organization of combat engineers where there are many women serving in that role, who even go to get their tab, to serve in a combat engineer organization, their sapper tab. Then you have a woman who goes to Ranger School, or is the company platoon leader, company commander, or battalion commander. No problem, no harm, no foul. They're already a lot of those organizations that have men and women. But when you go into special operations specifically, or the infantry, and you have 99.9% of everybody being a man, and then you have a woman come in who's the platoon leader or the company commander, and we have to make all these special exceptions for all these different things, it could be problematic. And I'm not going to be decisive or definitive on this because it's not my role. But here's what I'll say about Pete. Pete's the right guy for the job, most specifically because he's an outsider. And if we want profound change, we need somebody with an outside perspective who's not part of the bureaucratic system. That's going to be the simple, same, yes, ma'am, we don't need that. We need somebody who's going to look in the inside as an outsider, assess what's going on, talk to the troops on the ground, and make that profound change with courage, personal courage. That's what we need, is personal courage. We don't need a general coming in there. Also, lastly, very strongly, Pete has come out and said we need a 10-year restriction on generals working for the military-industrial complex, these big companies like Halliburton, working as, advisors, consultants, whatever it is, post their general experience. At the general level, they're making decisions as a flag officer to influence the logistics, funding, and supply of these companies that make billions of dollars based on the decisions that generals made, and now they're getting paid by those same companies post their military experience. I don't think it should be just 10 years. I think it should be banned completely. If you want a star and you want that responsibility and that role where you're making those decisions for the military industrial complex, for the rest of your life, you should be banned from working with those companies. If I was a SECDEF, that's the first thing that I would try to implement. The first priority of work needs to be the morale of the troops, because it's at an all-time low. He needs to also address recruiting and retention. Those are the three top priorities I would prioritize, and that comes with removing DEI, firing the bureaucrats, which is nearly impossible for civil servant contractors in the government. Nearly impossible. I would start with firing a lot of people, and then restoring the trust with the Secretary of Defense, the Defense Department, the civilians, and the military and the people who service our country, who serve and support our country and all the branches. I know I said that's last, but I want to put my name in the hat for Secretary of Veteran Affairs, because it's one of the 15 positions, I believe. As a former Sergeant Major and somebody who's been battling the Veteran Affairs system, being service connected 100% total and permanent, and seeing the damage, the destruction it does to veterans' lives, and how disgusting that is, I'd go in with the Sergeant Major position and the Sergeant Major in me and revamp that entire institution, starting with a lot of privatizing of the care for our veterans right out the gate, short term, so these veterans can get the help they need, the treatment they need. I deal with it myself from this back surgery that I dealt with, where I just got a bill in the mail for $350 for me to pay a payment for something that's service related to something that I'm getting treated with a decade after service, as I'm 100% total and permanent. I would fix all of that and completely revamp that entire organization. But I know I'm not in the running, but I'll just put that out there. Maybe you could tag, or maybe if you know somebody, you could put that in the comments and start communicating to people. Guys, I appreciate you. I just want to give you my input on that. My Patreon's down below. All the companies that support me and the channel are down below. If you want to support me, you could do that by supporting the links down below. Till next time, peace out.